Hello, welcome to the Bella Infidelity Stories channel, where we present true tales filled with surprising turns. If you found the video enjoyable, consider subscribing and giving it a thumbs up. It truly contributes to the growth of our channel. Now, let's immerse ourselves in the narrative. I'm Brian, 30 years old, residing in the quaint town of Pine Hills. It's a spot where familiarity reigns, and the pulse of activity relies on your own initiative to stir things up. I drive a truck, primarily transporting goods along the highways. I don't have a polished corporate position, nor do I engage in the typical 9-to-5 hustle. My existence is somewhat uncomplicated, perhaps tinged with a sense of solitude as well. Much of my time is dedicated to traveling, and when I finally return home, all I seek is a moment of tranquility. I have resided in this town for a few years now. It's calm, nothing particularly thrilling, but that suits me just fine. It's the sort of spot where you can enjoy a morning cup of coffee in peace, free from any interruptions. My home is humble, merely a quaint spot on the outskirts of town, and the neighbors are quite pleasant. One of my neighbors is Katie, and I've been acquainted with her for quite some time now. She's 38, slightly older than I am, but that doesn't really hold any significance in this context. We've always had a harmonious relationship, particularly because we both appreciate the leisurely rhythm of life. Katie is wed to Kevin, who is 40 years old. Kevin and I share a friendly rapport and occasionally spend time together, though he isn't around very often. He puts in long hours, and when he finally gets home, it seems he's too exhausted to engage in anything. Katie is quite an admirable individual, consistently warm and approachable, always ready to engage in conversation when you seek companionship. I perceive her strictly as a friend, and I believe she shares that sentiment. My days have settled into a familiar rhythm lately. When I return home on my days off, I often make an effort to spend time with Katie and Kevin whenever possible. Nothing particularly remarkable. We share a beer, chatting about the town, the weather, and all the familiar small-town topics. They are pleasant individuals, and I have no objections to their presence as neighbors. However, a shift has occurred lately. It wasn't instant, but I began to observe subtle details. Initially, it wasn't something that stood out. Katie would engage in longer conversations with me when we crossed paths, chuckle at my jokes a bit more than she typically did, and even in Kevin's absence, she'd extend an invitation to join her on the porch. I initially assumed she was simply being cordial, yet I began to sense that something felt slightly amiss. At times, her gaze would shift, as if she were noticing me with a newfound intensity that hadn't been there previously. Initially, I dismissed it. Perhaps I was dwelling on it too much. Well, she's in a marriage, isn't she? Kevin is her husband, and they have shared many years together. I never anticipated anything beyond friendship, yet that feeling lingered, refusing to let go. It was a Saturday evening, unremarkable and familiar, much like countless others before it. Having completed the task of unloading the truck, I was ready to relax and unwind for the evening. As I lounged on my front porch, savoring a chilled beer, I noticed Katie making her way toward her home. I waved, and she waved back, yet she didn't head inside as she typically would. Rather, she approached me. "Hey, Brian, do you have a moment to chat?" She inquired, her tone carrying a weightier note than normal. "Absolutely, of course," I remarked, placing my beard aside. "Hello there." She inhaled deeply, and I noticed the tension in her demeanor. An inexplicable sensation lingered, as if an unseen force was approaching. An unexpected turn of events. "May we have a conversation?" she inquired, settling beside me on the porch. I gazed at her, attempting to unravel the mystery of the situation. "Absolutely. What's happening, Katie?" She paused briefly, her gaze dropping to the ground before returning to meet my eyes. "It's just that I'm struggling to find the right words, but there's been a feeling that's been lingering with me for some time now." I arched an eyebrow, uncertain of the direction this was taking. "Could you clarify what you mean?" Katie adjusted her position, her fingers fidgeting as they intertwined in her lap. "I'm not quite sure how to put this into words, but I believe I've started to have feelings for you, Brian." My heart raced with excitement. I found myself questioning whether I had truly understood her words. I must have been misinterpreting her. "Excuse me, could you clarify that?" I remarked, striving to maintain my composure. She gazed at me, her eyes filled with an intensity, as though she had already revealed more than intended. "This may seem a bit outlandish. You are a cherished companion. I have always considered you a friend, but recently, things feel different. You occupy my thoughts endlessly." She hesitated, visibly grappling with her next words. "I'm quite displeased with Kevin. For quite some time, everything has felt off." I found myself at a loss for words. "Well, she's in a committed relationship. Kevin is her spouse. He is also my friend. How can you possibly say something like this?" "I never intended to create an uncomfortable situation," she said, her tone becoming gentler. "I simply had to express what was weighing on my mind. I have no expectations from you. I simply had to share this with you." I remained seated, a sense of unease stirring within me. I was at a loss for how to respond. A portion of my being experienced a sense of flattery, yet another segment was engulfed in guilt. We were discussing Kevin's wife. I couldn't simply ignore the significance of this. "I'm at a loss for words, Katie," I responded, fighting to maintain a steady tone. This caught me off guard. "You are united in marriage with Kevin. He is a friend of mine." She nodded slowly, her gaze drifting to her hands. "I understand, but I simply cannot continue to act as if everything is okay when it clearly isn't." We lingered in quietude for a brief spell, the gravity of our discussion palpable in the atmosphere. Uncertainty loomed over my next steps. I was uncertain whether to speak up or simply let it be. Yet, one thing was certain, my life had just become significantly more intricate. I was completely taken aback by this turn of events, particularly when it involves Katie. She was merely my neighbor, a person with whom I had always shared a friendly rapport. However, circumstances had shifted, and I found myself uncertain of the direction this would take. The dialogue with Katie left me utterly astounded. The thought lingered in my mind, refusing to fade away. There stood this woman, my neighbor, my friend's wife, revealing her emotions for me. It defied logic, and yet it stood before me. I was at a loss with the information, and I certainly felt uncertain about how to behave around her now. The remainder of the evening found me on the porch, gazing into the deepening twilight, lost in thought. Thoughts were swirling in my head. Had this been a lingering emotion for her? How could I have overlooked it? And, most crucially, what on earth was I meant to do now? I did not engage in cheating. I wasn't the type to get involved with another man's wife, particularly not with Kevin, who was a decent fellow. He was not worthy of any of this. Yet, it was Katie who had spoken those words. She felt discontent with Kevin. She made it clear to me that things had been off for some time. I was unaware of the specifics, yet I could infer. They were precisely the most affectionate couple I encountered. Certainly, they had shared many years together, yet Kevin was often preoccupied with work, and Katie always appeared somewhat aloof, at least from my perspective. At this point, clarity was beginning to dawn on me. The deeper I delved into my thoughts, the more I realized how foolish I truly was. I had been so absorbed in my own existence, my career, my journeys, that I failed to see the fractures in her relationship. I was oblivious to the fact that she could be seeking something deeper, something I never anticipated being involved in. I was torn between feeling sympathy for her and frustration at the predicament she had placed me in. The following day, I made an effort to steer clear of Katie. I had no desire to engage in conversation with her. Confronting her felt daunting, yet her presence lingered in my mind, an unshakable image that refused to fade. I attempted to concentrate on my trek to complete the task, yet my thoughts continually drifted back to her words. She had confessed, "You occupy my thoughts endlessly." It felt like a burden I couldn't shake off. Later that afternoon, I arrived home sooner than I typically do. The day on the road had been challenging, leaving me utterly drained. As I drove into the driveway, I noticed Katie perched on her porch, reminiscent of the previous night. As I parked, she glanced up, and for a fleeting instant, our gazes intertwined. Uncertain whether to acknowledge her with a wave or feign ignorance, I hesitated until she rose and approached me. "Brian," she called, and I sensed the uncertainty lacing her words. I remained motionless for a moment. This isn't something I wanted to pursue. I felt a reluctance to discuss the events of the previous night with her, yet I was also mindful of not wanting to come across as impolite. "Hey, Katie," I said, mustering a smile. "May we have a conversation?" She inquired, her tone gentle, nearly imploring. I nodded, uncertain of what other action to take. Certainly, we took a few steps away from the house, just far enough that Kevin wouldn't be able to hear us if he happened to be home. I make an effort to mask the tension on my face, yet I can sense its heavy presence bearing down on me. She started, inhaling deeply. "I understand this might feel abrupt, and I certainly don't want to create any tension between us, but I just—" "Katie," I interrupted her, not wanting her to continue. "You are in a marital union. This is not something I can simply overlook." "I understand," she replied swiftly. "I understand, and I truly regret it, but I've been experiencing these feelings for quite a while, and it was necessary for me to express them. I can no longer maintain the facade that it doesn't exist." "What was the reason for not discussing this with Kevin?" I inquired, the words escaping my lips before I could hold them back. "What brings you to me with this?" She cast her gaze downward, her shoulders drooping in defeat. I made an effort, yet it feels like everything has been off for quite a while. Our connection isn't what it once was. She glanced back at me, her eyes filled with desperation. "Brian, I'm feeling quite dissatisfied, and I believe it's evident to you." I couldn't refuse to acknowledge it. Kevin often seemed remote, perpetually weary upon his return home. What about Katie? She appeared to be perpetually in search of something beyond, something absent in her union. I found myself at a loss for words. "I'm not requesting anything from you." "I swear," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I simply had to express this feeling I've been holding inside. I apologize if it feels overwhelming." I inhaled deeply, attempting to soothe my nerves. "I'm at a loss for words, Katie. I truly do not. This entire situation is simply surprising. You are in a marital union. Your life unfolds alongside Kevin." She nodded with a measured grace, her lips quivering ever so slightly. "I'm aware. I understand. Yet, I cannot control my emotions." She hesitated. "I simply wish to share this with you. I wish to maintain our friendship. I hope this doesn't come off as strange." I nodded, though uncertainty lingered about my ability to make that promise. I found myself uncertain about how to navigate our friendship now. Not after what she had expressed. It was difficult to meet her gaze, my mind swirling with the weight of her recent revelation. "All right," I replied, at last. "We'll find a way to make it work. However, it's important to recognize that this situation is quite intricate." She offered a faint, melancholic smile. "I understand, Brian. I understand." We lingered in silence for a few more moments, both of us at a loss for words. The uncomfortable silence was unbearable, I knew I couldn't endure it indefinitely. I crafted my alibi and strolled back to my truck. I found myself uncertain about the future of our relationship and whether anything would shift between us. However, one thing remained certain. Everything had irrevocably changed. The following days seemed to linger in an odd state of uncertainty. A nagging sensation lingered, suggesting that something had changed in the dynamic between Katie and me, yet the specifics eluded me. Each time I laid eyes on her, a tightness gripped my chest. It was more than just awkward. The experience was quite unsettling. As if the atmosphere had become oppressively dense around us. What was I meant to do? She had voiced it, revealed emotions that I wasn't prepared for and wasn't certain I could reciprocate. I found myself uncertain about my desires, yet the entire situation loomed above me, casting a shadow I couldn't ignore. Like an ominous shadow, I found myself unable to escape. Focusing on work while traveling proved to be quite a challenge. The solitude of being on the truck only deepened my reflections on the conversation with Katie. Each time I found myself at home, I couldn't shake the anticipation of her coming to me once more, to revisit the conversation we had shared. The most challenging aspect? I struggled to find a way to behave naturally in her presence. She had shared something deeply personal with me, and there I stood, uncertain whether to pretend it never occurred or to respond in kind. And then it occurred. After a long day at work, I returned home one afternoon, feeling the familiar weight of fatigue. As I drove into my driveway, I noticed her at the edge of her porch, gazing in my direction. For a fleeting instant, I nearly hesitated to halt, yet she gestured for me to do so. I found myself ensnared. I parked the truck, uncertainty swirling within me as I contemplated how to confront her, yet I knew I couldn't turn away from it. I found myself facing this situation. I stepped outside and made my way over. "Hey, Katie," I said, making an effort to sound relaxed. "Hey, Brian," she responded, her voice gentle. She seemed different than usual. Her voice lacked the lightness it once held. It felt as though we were treading lightly, each word weighed with caution to avoid missteps. "Is everything all right?" I inquired, despite my uncertainty about whether I truly wished to find out. I sensed that the response wouldn't be to my liking. She paused, contemplating her response. "I've been reflecting on our conversation, and I want to ensure that I don't complicate things. It's important to me that we maintain a comfortable dynamic between us." I nodded deliberately, a knot forming in my stomach. "I understand that. There's a great deal to take in." Katie inhaled deeply and moved forward, her hands gently intertwined before her. "I simply want to ensure that you're doing well. I aim to avoid putting any pressure on you, Brian. This was never my intention." I found myself at a loss for words. I never intended to burden her with guilt over her words, yet I found myself struggling with the situation at hand. I'm at a loss on how to approach this situation. It's intricate. You are in a committed relationship. I have no intention of interfering with your relationship with Kevin. I understand, she replied hastily. I don't desire that either. However, you are not alone in facing this circumstance. I find myself in a state of discontent, feeling as though I've been trapped in this situation for an extended period. I assumed I was the sole observer, but it seems I was mistaken. Her gaze locked onto mine, filled with a yearning for comprehension. I was uncertain about whether I could offer her that. She was bound to a husband, a man to whom she had vowed her existence. I couldn't simply dive into that, not without dismantling something in the process. I'm not sure what you're expecting me to express, Katie. I expressed my growing frustration. This isn't my area of expertise. This is a matter for you and Kevin to resolve together. Her expression relaxed, and I sensed the pain my words had caused her. I never intended to cause her pain, yet I found myself at a loss for words. I know, she whispered, as if sharing a secret with the air around her. I don't anticipate you will resolve it. I suppose I just needed reassurance that you don't view me as irrational for experiencing these feelings. I found myself standing there, caught in a moment of uncertainty. As much as I yearned to step away, to leave the dialogue in the past, it proved to be far more complicated than I had anticipated. The atmosphere between us was already charged. It felt as though there was an unseen boundary that remained uncrossable. I felt the urge to express something, to provide a sense of solace, yet I found myself unable to do so. This was not a circumstance that could be resolved with mere kind words or gestures. The answer was anything but straightforward. You should really have a conversation with Kevin. If you're feeling discontent, it's important to confront those feelings. This isn't something I can engage with, I declared, my tone resolute, despite the uncertainty swirling within me. Katie nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I'm at a loss, and I really don't know what my next step should be. I was unable to provide her with a response. This role wasn't meant for me. Katie, I may not have the solution, but you're not alone in this journey. Have a conversation with Kevin. Engage with another person. I cannot find myself caught in this situation. She nodded with a measured grace, gently dabbing at her tear-streaked cheeks. I comprehend. I apologize, Brian. I never intended to place you in this situation. Words escaped me in that moment. I felt a pang of reluctance as I considered her standing there, yet I understood that my presence couldn't linger any longer. Not when I was engulfed in such confusion about everything. I pivoted to head back to my truck. I apologize, Katie. I truly am. I trust you'll find a solution. As I strolled away, an undeniable sensation washed over me, as if the very earth beneath my feet had transformed. I was uncertain about what lay ahead for us, or if we could ever return to the way things once were. Yet, no matter what was unfolding, it was an issue I couldn't overlook. I couldn't simply act as if it was insignificant. I had been on the road for what seemed like an eternity, attempting to distract myself from the discussion with Katie. My hands clutched the steering wheel with an unusual intensity, and my mind was a whirlwind of chaos. I despised how everything had changed between us. I despised how she had turned everything into such a tangled mess. Yet above all, I loathed the reality that she remained tied to another. It was impossible for me to overlook that. The most challenging aspect? I found myself uncertain about her emotions regarding me. I had a fondness for Katie. I have always maintained a warm and approachable demeanor. Yet, I never imagined she would have such feelings for me. The vision of her lingering in that moment haunted me, as she confided her discontent with Kevin, expressing a yearning for something greater. I was at a loss regarding how to handle that information. The following day, as I returned to the driveway after a lengthy journey, I caught sight of her. Katie stood on her porch once more, as if she were anticipating my arrival. She waved, and I felt a moment of uncertainty before stepping out of the truck. The constant back and forth was exhausting, yet I understood that ignoring her wasn't an option. "Hey," I called out, approaching at a measured pace. "Hey, Brian," she replied, her voice gentle and soothing. "May we have a conversation?" I was uncertain about diving into another conversation akin to the previous one, yet I found myself nodding. Absolutely. We lingered in silence, both of us at a loss for words. The air was charged with an unmistakable tension, palpable and dense, yet I found myself at a loss for how to break the silence that enveloped us. "I've been pondering," Katie remarked, shattering the stillness. "I aim to keep things simple for you. I simply must understand if you share my feelings." I gazed at her, bewildered. "What are we discussing?" She cast her gaze at her hands before finally locking eyes with me once more. "Reflecting on my emotions. Regarding what I shared with you. I've been contemplating whether it was merely an error or if I genuinely mean it." I took a deep breath. This proved to be quite a challenge. "Katie, I've mentioned it before, I'm not the one to resolve this. I'm not the right person to discuss your marriage with. It's essential that you have a conversation with Kevin." "I understand," she murmured, "but you occupy my thoughts endlessly. I wish to escape this predicament. I refuse to maintain the facade that everything is okay when it clearly isn't. Yet, I also wish to hold on to you." The impact of the words was more profound than I had anticipated. Though I tried to resist the urge, it was difficult not to feel a pang of sympathy for her. She found herself trapped in a marriage that brought her no joy, and now she was projecting her emotions onto me. It felt unjust for both of us, and I was uncertain about how much longer I could maintain the facade. I inhaled deeply, attempting to find my balance. "I'm unable to provide what you're seeking, Katie. I am unable to do that. I prefer to stay out of this situation." Her gaze fell, and she acquiesced, yet the disappointment was evident on her face. "I comprehend. I simply had to find out." The stillness lingered in the air for a heartbeat before I found my voice once more. "I apologize, Katie. I truly am. However, it's essential that you have a conversation with Kevin. I prefer not to find myself caught in the center of this situation." She whispered, "I know. I found myself at a loss for who to reach out to. I feel utterly adrift. I found myself without any answers for her. I was unable to resolve this for her. Yet, I found it impossible to leave without a sense of guilt weighing on me. She was my neighbor and a dear friend. I never intended to cause her pain, yet I found myself at a loss for alternatives. I am not the appropriate individual for this, I stated with conviction. I doubt I ever will be. This can't continue between us, Katie. This situation isn't just for either of us. She nodded once more, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I understand. I apologize, Brian. There's no need for apologies, I stated, as the heaviness of it all pressed down on my heart. However, a choice must be made. It's time to stop lingering in this uncertain space. Katie fell silent for a moment. She remained motionless, her gaze distant, as though she were adrift in contemplation. It pained me to part ways in this matter, yet deep down, I understood it was necessary. I realized I couldn't continue attempting to mend what wasn't my responsibility to mend. After a moment of contemplation, I finally expressed, I need some time to think. I'm heading indoors now. She remained silent. She simply nodded, dabbing at her eyes. I pivoted and made my way to the truck, avoiding any glance behind me. It pained me to witness the sorrow etched on her features, yet I could not overlook the reality that I was stepping away from something I felt I could never truly belong to. I was uncertain about my decision, yet I realized I could no longer continue on this path with her. As I pulled into my garage, a sense of relief washed over me, yet an unsettling notion lingered, as if I had inadvertently allowed something significant to slip through my fingers. I found myself uncertain about my actions. But I couldn't continue to be the one caught in the chaos of her life. It had been a few days since I last spoke with Katie. I wasn't intentionally avoiding her, that wasn't my intention, but I had been isolating myself. Time was essential for me. It's a moment for reflection, a chance to discern my desires and aversions. Throughout the day, my thoughts continually wandered back to that discussion with Katie. The burden of guilt clung to me, impossible to shake off. Although I was certain I had made the right choice by being honest with her, it didn't alleviate the difficulty of the situation. Whenever her face appeared in my thoughts, a sense of disappointment washed over me, yet I understood that I couldn't allow myself to become entangled in matters that weren't mine to bear. As I arrived at my driveway that afternoon, it seemed like any ordinary day, yet there was an unmistakable shift within me. There was an unsettling quality to the atmosphere. I brought the truck to a stop, inhaled deeply, and cast my eyes toward her home. Katie found herself once more on her porch. This time, her demeanor was different, she wasn't simply waving or appearing to be friendly. A distinct energy filled the air. She appeared as though she was anticipating something, perhaps hoping I would regain my clarity. I let out a heavy breath. This was not going to be a simple task. I strolled through the yard, the sound of my boots crunching on the gravel beneath me. Katie noticed my approach and adjusted her posture, adopting a demeanor that was noticeably more composed and earnest than her typical self. Brian, she stated, her tone steady yet resolute. It's time for a conversation. I nodded, striving to maintain my composure. Indeed, I thought we had. Her gaze met mine, a silent quest for understanding reflected in her eyes. Perhaps a sense of comfort, perhaps a touch of empathy. It was unclear to me, yet I understood that this was a dialogue I could no longer evade. Regarding the events of our previous encounter, she started, hesitating as if searching for the perfect expression. I've been reflecting on your words, and I've come to understand that I can no longer maintain the facade that everything is okay. I feel trapped in this marriage, yet I also want to avoid causing pain to Kevin. I understand he has his flaws, yet I wish to preserve what we have. A flicker of compassion stirred within me. Her eyes revealed a deep struggle, a palpable conflict, yet I understood that I wasn't the one meant to resolve it. Katie, you really need to stop pulling me into this. I've mentioned it previously, I'm not the person you should be discussing this with. I'm not the person who can assist you in finding solutions. She nodded slowly, as if she were coming to terms with a truth she wished to avoid. I understand, but I must hear it once more. I seek reassurance that my thoughts are grounded in reality. I had a feeling you could share that sentiment. I wondered if, perhaps, I wasn't losing my mind for having these feelings for you. I shook my head, feeling a constriction in my chest. Katie, I've mentioned this previously, I can't find myself caught up in the middle of this situation. I have no desire to cause you pain, yet I also wish to distance myself from your marriage. I am not the solution. Her shoulders drooped, the burden of my words enveloping her like a heavy shroud. I comprehend, I see. I suppose I just needed to hear it from you as well. We lingered in that moment, the air thick with unspoken words. Time seemed to stand still. It felt as though this moment, this exchange, marked the conclusion of something that had never truly begun. At last, I uttered another word, my tone gentler this time. Katie, it's important for you to concentrate on your relationship. It's important that you have a conversation with Kevin. This situation isn't just unfair to you, it's also unfair to him to continue down this path. She averted her gaze, dabbing at her tears, her voice scarcely rising above a whisper. I understand, I've been afraid of the consequences of confronting reality. Yet, I find myself yearning to escape this state of uncertainty. I understand, I replied, stepping back slightly. However, a choice must be made, Katie. The moment has arrived for you both. She gazed at me, her expression a blend of sorrow and resignation. I believe I understand the course of action I need to take. It's simply challenging. I nodded, grasping the depths of her thoughts more than she realized. Indeed, I understand it's challenging, but you don't have to face it by yourself. I'm not suggesting it will be simple, but you must confront it, for your own tranquility. Katie offered a faint smile. Her eyes brimmed with a deep sense of appreciation. Thanks, Brian. I suppose I simply required confirmation from another person. A person who remains detached from all of this. Whenever you need, I replied, giving a slight smile. Please make sure to look after yourself, okay? She nodded, and I noticed the relief in her eyes, though it was tinged with a hint of uncertainty. It was far from the end for her, not even close. Yet, I trust this dialogue marked a pivotal moment. A pivotal moment where she could seize the reins of her life and confront the difficult choices that lay ahead. I began to walk back to my truck when Katie's voice halted me in my tracks. Brian, she said. I spun around. Indeed, I have no regrets about our conversation, she murmured gently, despite the difficulty it brought. I'm pleased I made that choice. I offered her a nod, a quiet recognition of the path we had traveled together. Wishing you well, Katie. With that, I climbed into my truck and drove away, the roar of the engine breaking the stillness around me. As I pulled away, a singular truth settled in my mind. Transformations were unfolding. It's not solely about Katie, it applies to me as well. The curtain was falling on this chapter. Even though it posed challenges, it seemed like the appropriate course of action.